Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. We lost a day yesterday, I'm sorry about that. Didn't quite work out with filming and everything like that. So hopefully I'll actually make up for that and post a video on Saturday, so it'll still be a 5-day video week. But this is an exciting video for me today because I'm talking about my favorite thing that I read this year, easily, by far. And that's saying something because I've read a lot of things that I really liked this year. This was my favorite. So that's why I'm calling this my favorite book of the year. I don't know if it'll live out that as being my favorite book of the year, because even though I had a reading experience that was great recently, which was All the King's Men, I don't think I could consider it a favorite because it was just a little too emotionally harrowing for me, and I don't want to reread it. This book was so good that I didn't want to make a video about it because I wanted to reread it before I did, because I wanted to do it right when I made my video on it. So it's a book so nice, I read it twice, and now and to be honest, I liked it even more a second time through. It's Edmund Goss's Father and Son. Now, the worst thing about this book is its title, admittedly. Father and Son is not a great title. But it's made worse by the fact that this Oxford World Classics edition of the book doesn't include the subtitle, which is great and defines exactly what this book is. That subtitle is A Study of Two Temperaments, and that could honestly just be the title, because when I think of Father and Son, the first thing I think of is the Turgenev novel, which I'm assuming is much more popular than this book is. But it also weirdly, and I think unfortunately, genders it as well. I mean, father and son will make you think of, you know, a typically male experience, but there's nothing, I think, especially reading it again, that is typically male about this book. I mean, obviously, the two main characters are men, but A Study of Two Temperaments is much more accurate because we're talking about much more universally interesting subjects, other than something like masculinity, which would be the clash between science and reason, the clash between parents and children, the clash between generations, the young and the old. I mean, all of these things that I personally find to be fascinating and very interesting, and it's much more accurately summed up in that subtitle. And by the way, even though this book isn't a scientific study or anything like that, it does function as a kind of study of two temperaments. He talks and mentions specifically in this book that he is not writing a biography of his dad, and he's not writing an autobiography of himself. And he lives up to that in both ways, because this is not a story of his dad from life till death, and this is not a story of himself up until the point that he's writing it. It's a story about a very specific point in Edmund Goss's life where he's growing up under his dad's care, and ends at a point where they officially diverge in terms of their opinions on religion and how to live life and what is true and what is right. And it's a pretty emotional story overall. It's a true story, so we're still continuing our nonfiction kick. Sorry about that, but this is one of the greats of nonfiction that I've read, especially this year. And I mentioned that it's in this Oxford World Classics edition. I don't happen to like Oxford World Classics that much, to be honest, and I especially don't prefer them over a Penguin Classic, but it doesn't seem that there is a Penguin Classic of this book, which I think is odd, but this edition is really good. Outside of the fact that there is no reference to the subtitle here, there is an introduction, a preface, and there's explanatory notes in the back, which I found to be very helpful. There's also an appendix with some interesting sort of extra material. So this is definitely a recommended volume for me. It was the one that was easiest to get my hands on. I don't know if there are other editions of it. It didn't really look like it. So if you ever come across a copy of this specific edition, I would recommend it. I think it has all of the things that you'd want in a modern edition of this book, which I really appreciated. But the book itself, to get to that, is a story of Edmund Goss and his dad, and the study of how their two different temperaments affected one another. Edmund Goss's dad, his name was Philip, which he's never really referred to as in the book, but Edmund Goss's dad is thoroughly, zealously religious, and he's a particular strain of kind of Protestantism that I think is really interesting. He and his parishioners refer to themselves as the saints, which I think is really interesting. It's definitely a kind of flavor of Protestantism, but he's not an Anglican or a Presbyterian or anything like that. I don't know exactly how to categorize it. It was one of the questions that I had while reading this book, but he is zealously devoted to this faith. He is sort of a minister in a parish, but he is also a devoted scientist. He was a devoted scientist, and he wrote very well-respected scientific studies of particularly marine biology. And in a particularly sweet moment, Edmund Goss talks about how he's like, I don't know, 6 years old, 8 years old, something like that, and helping his dad explore coral reefs around around their home, and he actually discovers a particular kind of coral that his dad references and gives a name to, and then notes that his son found it in a work of marine biology that was very popular and well respected at the time, which I thought was really sweet. And there's also an amazing ecological strain that runs through this book. Edmund Goss talks about how the coral reefs of his childhood have been wrecked and ruined by the people in the area as he's gotten older, and now he can't even recognize the coral reefs that he loved to be in so much as a child, and that his dad loved to study so much when he was a child. So it's very sad, and it's one of the many sad strains that run throughout this book. But later I want to talk about some of the absolutely hilarious strains that run throughout this book as well, and I think that's what makes it so awesome, is the fact that you have these really quite tragic moments, really quite sad moments, but then you also have these moments of really quite knee-slappingly hilarious stuff, which I'll get into. But one of the other sad things that I just have to address at the outset is that Edmund Goss is being raised by his dad because his mother dies when he's only 6 years old. She dies of breast cancer. And, man, it's a pretty harrowing description of her dying of breast cancer. The junk medicine that she's subjected to. I just, in my last video, talked about The Age of Wonder by Richard Holmes, and that's another thing that he talks about in that book, which is the development of, medicine during the Age of Wonder, or more modern medicine during the Age of Wonder. Edmund Goss's mother dies right at the cusp of some advancements in medicine that would have helped her, and it's very sad to see, and Edmund Goss remarks on that as well in this book, where he says, now that I'm an adult and I'm older and the world is different, you can't imagine what my mother was subjected to. Basically getting no real medical treatment, getting subjected to just the worst kind of charlatanry in terms of medical care, and the only person who was really there to help her in a lot of moments was her 6-year-old son, who would just kind of dote on her and try and give her what she needed to sort of ameliorate some of the pain that she was experiencing. But she succumbed to that, obviously, and died in a very tragic way. And that left father and son alone, and to be raised, and for the dad to raise his son on his own. I should also mention and clarify that they had a great marriage. Edmund Goss's parents were frightfully devoted to each other. In fact, I wanted to read this. This is one of the funny moments. This is like a scene straight out of Tristram Shandy, where Edmund Goss talks about his own birth. He goes, long afterwards, my father told me that my mother suffered much in giving birth to me, and that, uttering no cry, I appeared to be dead. I was laid with scant care on another bed in the room, while all anxiety and attention was concentrated on my mother. An old woman who happened to be there and who was unemployed turned her thoughts to me and tried to awaken me a spark of vitality. She succeeded, and she was afterwards complimented by the doctor on her cleverness. My father could not, when he told the story, recollect the name of my preserver. I had often longed to know who she was, For all the rapture of life, for all of its turmoils, its anxious desires, its manifold pleasures, and for its sorrow and suffering, I bless and praise that anonymous old lady from the bottom of my heart. But yeah, kind of funny, kind of sad, a little bit bitter that his dad doesn't even remember the name of the woman who basically, slapped him awake as a child. But anyway, yes, they had it. They were frightfully devoted to each other, both as a husband and wife, but also fellow zealots in this religion. They were absolutely devoted to their religion to a point of, self-harm. They made their lives worse because of it, and that's part of what this book is about. It's about that zealotry that ruined a relationship between a father and a son to some extent, and made everyone's lives worse in a very marked degree. Notably, that mother who ends up passing. She was a storyteller. She loved telling stories. Snippets of her private secret diary that Edmund Goss found are included in this book, and laced all throughout the early chapters when he's describing his mother and his brief life with her. And they are so sad. They are just so sad. Descriptions of how much this woman loved to tell stories, but she felt that to do so would be was a sin. Who knows why? I don't really know why. Edmund Goss, I think, expresses a similar confusion as to why she held it was so devoted to the idea that to engage in any type of fiction was a sin. But she stifled all creativity in Edmund as much as she possibly could, stopped him from reading any books of even, Shakespeare or whatnot, and the only thing that Edmund was allowed to read was, the Bible, obviously, and a few pieces of devotional literature. But other than that, she absolutely was adamantly opposed to any type of fiction whatsoever, including and especially in herself. And so there are snippets in her diary of her talking about how badly she wants to tell stories and how badly she wants to be creative, but she has to stifle that within her because she thinks that is her greatest sin, and she's actually embarrassed about it and ashamed that she feels such a calling to tell stories. And Edmund Goss rightly wonders whether or not she could have been a great novelist had she, well, of course, lived longer, but also had she allowed herself to engage in some of those creative pursuits that she was so staunchly opposed to. So anyway, that makes for some sad reading at parts, but what makes this book so great is that it has these lighthearted moments. It has these moments of real youthful exuberance or youthful folly. The truth of the matter is, if I can speak plainly here on my own channel, Edmund Goss, as a child, was a little shit. He was definitely a little shit, and the descriptions of himself being like a little, just being a little brat are hilarious, because his mom dies, he's being raised by his dad, and I know that when my mother would leave for whatever reason, and it was just me and my dad, I too would become a little shit as well. And so some of these descriptions of him are hilarious. It's not so much that he's a troublemaker, it's that he he's super judgmental, which I think is hilarious. He's such a judgmental little kid. He judges other people, he judges himself, he judges it. It's very funny, and I wanted to read out a couple of examples. The first of which is probably my favorite. It's an example where Edmund is going to be introduced to his stepmom for the first time. This happens all the way in chapter 10. And the dad sits Edmund on his knee at the beginning of the chapter and says, "Look, I found you a new mother. This is going to be the woman that I'm marrying." So he goes, "It is Miss Brightwin. So far, so good. And I was well pleased. But unfortunately, I remember that it was my duty to testify in season and out of season," which means basically to evangelize. He goes, I therefore asked with much earnestness, "But, Papa, is she one of the Lord's children?" He replied with gravity that she was. "Has she taken her cross in baptism?" I went on, but this was my own strong point as a believer. My father looked a little shamefaced and replied, "Well, she has not yet seen the necessity of that, but we must pray that the Lord may make her way clear before her. You see, she has been brought up hitherto in the so-called Church of England." Our positions were now curiously changed. It seemed as if it were I who was the jealous monitor and my father the deprecating penitent. I sat up and shook a finger at him. "Papa," I said, "don't tell me she's a pedo-Baptist." Because I had lately acquired that valuable word, and I seized this remarkable opportunity of using it. It affected my father painfully, but he repeated his assurance that if we united our prayers and set the scripture plan plainly before Miss Brightwin, there could be no doubt that she would see her way to accepting the doctrine of adult baptism. And he said, "We must judge not, lest we ourselves be judged." I had just enough tact to let that pass, but I was quite aware that our whole system was one of judging, and that we had no intention whatever of being judged ourselves. Yet even at the age of 11, one sees that on certain occasions to press home the truth is not convenient. And then he goes on to describe a hilarious moment where when his mother dies, his father gets like a housekeeper, Miss Marks, who is like loony and like totally smitten with him, very much wants to be this man's new wife, and very much wants to be Edmund's mother. And so Edmund describes this moment. He goes, "Just before Christmas, on a piercing night of frost, my father brought us his bride. The smartening up of the house, the new furniture, the removal of my own possessions to a private bedroom, the wedding gifts of the saints, and all these things paled in interest before the fact that Miss Marks had made a scene in the course of the afternoon. I was dancing about the drawing room and was saying, 'Oh, I'm so glad my new mamma is coming,' when Miss Marks called out in an unnatural voice, 'Oh, you cruel child!' And I stopped in amazement and stared at her, whereupon she threw Prudence to the winds and moaned, 'I had once thought I should be your dear mamma.' I was simply stupefied, and I expressed my horror in terms that were clear and strong. Thereupon Miss Marks had a wild fit of hysterics, while I looked on, wholly unsympathetic and still deeply affronted. The consequence was that she withdrew in a moist and quivering condition to her boudoir, where she had locked herself in when I, all smiles and caresses, was welcoming the bride and bridegroom on the doorstep as politely as if I were a valued old family retainer." He's so mean to Miss Marks. It's so funny. Oh my gosh. And I'm sorry, I have to read you this too. It is unbelievably funny. The drama of this moment makes me so... So, this particular Christian denomination is obviously Anabaptist, right? So these are adults being baptized, which is why we get that reference to pedo-baptizers, which is something I've never heard before, but it's so funny. It's so funny. But so, as an adult, Edmund gets baptized, but he's barely an adult. He's super young when he gets baptized, and it's clear that he gets baptized because he's basically the minister's child. But Philip, the dad, he makes it rigorous. He doesn't just baptize his son because he's his son. He wants to make it clear to the community that he's baptizing his son because his son is especially religious and especially pious. This, of course, makes Edmund even more insufferable. to all of his fellow youngsters, because now he's baptized and he's a part of the brethren and they aren't. But because he is so young and he's getting baptized, this sort of makes the news in the town, and a bunch of people show up to see his baptism. One of those people is a couple called the Brookses, and so this is and because the Brookses show up, they decide and they're moved to become brethren as well, to be a part of the saints and get baptized as well. And so he says, the case of the Brookses was much talked about and was attributed in a distant sense to me. That is to say, if I had not been an object of public curiosity, the Brookses might have remained in the bond of iniquity. I, therefore, took a particular interest in them, and as I presently heard that they were extremely poor, I was filled with a fervent longing to minister to their necessities. Somebody had lately given me a present of money, and I begged little sums here and there until I reached the very considerable figure of 7 shillings and 6 pence. With these coins safe in a little linen bag, I started one Sunday afternoon without saying anything to anyone and arrived at the Brooks' cottage in Barton. John Brooks was a heavy, dirty man with a pock-marked face and 2 left legs. His broad and red face carried small side whiskers in the manner of that day, but was otherwise unshaven. Was otherwise shaved, sorry. When I reached the cottage, husband and wife were at home, doing nothing at all in the approved Sunday style. I was received by them with some surprise, but I quickly explained my mission and produced my linen bag. To my disgust, all John Brooks said was, "I knowed the Lord would provide." And after emptying my little bag into the palm of an enormous hand, he swept the contents into his trousers pocket and slapped his leg. He said not a single word of thanks or appreciation, and I was absolutely cut to the heart. I think that in the course of a long life, I have never experienced a more bitter disappointment. And then he goes on and says, the springs of benevolence had dried up within me, and to this day I have never entirely recovered from the shock of John Brooks's coarse leer and his "I knowed the Lord would provide." The infant plant of philanthropy was burned in my bosom as if by quicklime. And I think that whole, I don't know, I found that to be very funny because it's so dramatic. Oh, how the good Lord does test my patience with this camera. Oh my goodness. Battery died on me. Can't believe it. And you know what's even worse is the fact that I have a spare battery. For instances like this, where the battery just dies for no reason because it's got a battery that has 2 minutes of life in it, and then for some reason that battery just leeches charge if it's not being used. So when the battery inexplicably dies and the camera, and I swap in the second battery, it's also dead. So then 2 hours later, if the camera's finally recharged enough to continue my video, instead of being able to just swap in a new battery and keep going, I have to wait 2 hours to let the camera charge back up. But we're back in business, and I watched over what I recorded in the first half, just to make sure that I didn't lose anything much, and I didn't, so we'll get right back to it. But I do have to apologize because I said the name Edmund Goss about 6,000 times, so sorry about that. Take a shot every time I say Edmund Goss in that previous section. I bet you'll end up hospitalized before the end of it. I don't know why I do that. Sometimes I have this tick when I'm making videos where instead of just saying Edmund or the person's first or last name, I say both of them. I give their full Christian name every single time I want to reference them. So from now on, anytime I want to refer to Edmund Goss, I'll spare you the last name. But I was talking before I got cut off about how I had read about father and son from this book, The Flamingo Smile, from Stephen Jay Gould. Now, I had already heard about father and son prior to that, but this really just tipped the scales. Gould in one of his essays in here, I believe it's Adam's Navel. It's one of my favorite essays. Not definitely my favorite essay in here. It's one of my favorite essays, honestly, that I've read. It's incredible, and he talks about Edmund's father, Philip, and he talks about how Philip Goss wrote this book called Omphalos. And Omphalos, oh my gosh, how fascinating! Omphalos was the way that the religiously inclined Philip Goss tried to reconcile the new science that was revealing itself principally through geology, and also archaeology and the finding of fossils and whatnot. Not archaeology. Yeah, some archaeology. Yeah, the finding of fossils, but as principally geology, which was suggesting that the Earth was, one, way older than could be accounted for based on the creation account in the Bible, and two, that the animals that we see around us today are the product of natural selection and mutation over time. And that was something that people like Edmund Goss's father, I said his full name again, were not able to reconcile together. So he created this, he wrote this fascinating and crazy book called Omphalos, where essentially he suggested that the world as we saw it, with all of the fossils, as we see it, where all of the fossils and all of the different strata in rocks and whatnot, all of the information that geologists and archaeologists and biologists were finding to date the world and to suggest that animals were changing over time, all of those had been placed in one moment of creation, and they had all been created that way. That's how the Earth spawned into being. It spawned into being with the rocks in that way, and the fossils in that way. And this was going to be his way of reconciling the Genesis account with the new science that was burgeoning at the time. And so Stephen Jay Gould writes this, and I think this is unbelievably interesting. He says, although Goss reconciled himself to a God who would create such a minutely detailed, illusory past, this notion was anathema to most of his countrymen. The British are a practical, empirical people, a nation of shopkeepers, in Adam Smith's famous phrase. They tend to respect the facts of nature at face value and rarely favor the complex systems of non-obvious interpretation so popular in much of continental thought. The Reverend Charles Kingsley, an intellectual leader of unquestionable devotion to God and science, spoke for a consensus, in stating that he could not, quote, give up the painful and slow conclusion of 25 years' study of geology, and believe that God has written on the rocks one enormous and superfluous lie. Wow. Wow. Now, I could keep reading, but I'm not going to. So that's what Omphalos was. And Edmund was young when his dad wrote Omphalos. But he was able to record what the reaction to Omphalos was, which was a patent dismissal from both the scientific community, the atheist community, whatever that looked like at the time, and also the Christian community as well. It was just roundly disregarded in examples in statements like that, the one that I just mentioned, and so. Stephen Jay Gould actually quotes this book directly. He quotes Edmund directly and says, he offered it with a glowing gesture to atheists and Christians alike. This was to be the universal panacea. This the system of intellectual therapeutics which could not but heal all the maladies of the age. But alas, atheists and Christians alike looked at it and laughed and threw it away. And so this throws the father, Philip, into an even deeper depression than the one that he was in after his wife died, and it led to a quite dramatic moment. And so I wanted to read that because this is the moment that makes this book particularly interesting to me. It's the moment when Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. And so this is what Edmund writes. He goes, so through my father's brain, in that year of scientific crisis, 1857, there rushed two kinds of thought, each absorbing, each convincing, yet totally irreconcilable. This is a particular agony in the paradox. There is a particular agony in the paradox that truth has two forms, each of them indisputable, yet each antagonistic to the other. It was this discovery that there were two theories of physical life, each of which was true, but the truth of each incompatible with the truth of the other, which shook the spirit of my father with perturbation. It was not really a paradox, it was a fallacy. If he could only have known it, but he allowed the turbid volume of superstition to drown the delicate stream of reason. He took one step in the service of truth, and then he drew back in an agony, accepted the servitude of error. This was the great moment in the history of thought when the theory of the mutability of species was preparing to throw a flood of light upon all departments of human speculation and action. It was becoming necessary to stand emphatically in one army or the other. Darwin had long been collecting facts with regard to the variation of animals and plants. Hooker and Wallace, each in his own sphere, were coming closer and closer to the perception of that secret which was first to reveal itself clearly to the patient and humble genius of Darwin. In the year before, in 1856, Darwin, under pressure from Lyell, had begun that modest statement of the new revelation, that abstract of an essay which developed so mightily into The Origin of Species. My father's attitude towards the theory of natural selection was critical in his career, and oddly enough, it exercised an immense influence on my own experience as a child. Let it be admitted at once, mournful as the omission is, that every instinct in his intelligence went out at first to greet the new light. It had hardly done so when a recollection of the opening chapter of Genesis checked it at the outset. He concluded with Carpenter, a great investigator, but one who was fully as incapable as himself of remodeling his ideas with regard to the old accepted hypotheses. They both determined, on various grounds, to have nothing to do with the terrible theory, but to hold steadily to the law of the fixity of species. It was exactly at this juncture that we left London, and the slight and occasional, but always extremely salutary personal intercourse with men of scientific leading, which my father had enjoyed at the British Museum and at the Royal Society, came to an end. His next act was to burn his ships, down to the last beam and log out of which a raft could have been made. By a strange act of willfulness, he closed the doors upon himself forever. Sorry for quoting that for so long, but wow. I mean, it's so sad, too, because you read this, and this is coming off of the heels of a scientific career that was lauded and really was Philip's balm in the midst of the struggles that he was dealing with over the loss of his wife, where as bad as it was that he lost his beloved wife and had to raise his son on his own, he was able to make a living for himself. He was able to care for his son by being a well-respected scientist and giving a series of lectures that people took seriously. And that is what killed him the most when he publishes Omphalos, and it receives one negative review after another, after another, after another, and his ego takes more and more and more and more of a hit as various people who respected and loved him and really appreciated his work had to turn their backs on a theory that they just could not take seriously. And it sucks. It sucks to read. And there's a lot of things like that that suck. Here's another one. This is just absolutely baffling. And as much sympathy as I have for Philip Goss, I have to say this, I think, is completely unacceptable behavior. Even if he was, maybe not educated enough to understand it or whatever, he should have known better, I think. Edmund writes, "My father was almost maddeningly," and very much maddeningly, not almost maddeningly. "My father was almost maddeningly desirous that these afflictions should be sanctified to me, and it was in my bed, often when I was much bowed in spirit by indisposition, that he used to triumph over me most piteously." And what he's referring to here is that his dad would basically assumed that all malady was the result of sin. And so if Edmund was sick, as he often was as a child, no thanks to the insaneness of his, I mentioned her before, housekeeper, maid, whatever, Miss Marks, who dressed him continually in sweaters and kept him out of the sun all of the time, he assumed that his son must be sinning and must be guilty of something. And that was why he, quote, triumphed over him so piteously in the moments when Edmund was sick and confined to his bed. And he continues, "He retained the singular superstition, amazing in a man of scientific knowledge and long human experience, that all pains and ailments were directly sent by the Lord in chastisement for some definite fault, and not in relation to any physical cause. The result was sometimes quite startling, and in particular I recollect that my stepmother and I exchanged impressions of astonishment at my father's action when Miss Goodyear, who was one of the saints and the wife of a young journeyman cobbler, broke her leg. My father puzzled for an instant as to the meaning of this accident, since Miss Goodyear was the gentlest and most inoffensive of our church members, decided that it must be because she had made an idol of her husband. And he reduced the poor thing to tears by standing at her bedside and imploring the Holy Spirit to bring this sin home to her conscience." I mean, it's awful. It's just awful to read that. We can thank goodness that we don't deal with that as much anymore. But it's still a shame that it does happen, and it's awful every time it does. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Well, should I leave it there? I do love the book. I love the book so much, and I think it's a great reading experience. And I'm sorry for having read so much of it, but it's kind of hard to put it down. It's short too, so you can theoretically read it in one sitting. I didn't. I read it over a course of a couple of days because I was really enjoying it and I wanted to, extend the experience. And then, I sat on it for about a week and then, well, maybe 2. Yeah, 2 weeks. Yeah. And then went back to it and enjoyed it even more the second time. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I appreciate you sticking with me through that. And I think just to close out, I'll read the beginning of chapter 1, because if this doesn't make you want to read the rest of the book, I don't know what will. This is how the book starts. Chapter 1, he goes, "This book is the record of a struggle between two temperaments, two consciousnesses, and almost two epochs. It ended, as was inevitable, in disruption. Of the two human beings here described, one was born to fly backward, the other could not help but being carried forward. There came a time when neither spoke the same language as the other, or encompassed the same hopes, or was fortified by the same desires. But at last it is some consolation to the survivor that neither, to the very last hour, ceased to respect the other or to regard him with a sad indulgence."